continuing debate. The honourable member for Calgary, Midnapore.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll start by saying I will be splitting my time with the member for St. Albert Edmonton. He's always got such incredibly intelligent debate, and I always look forward to his words. I'll also start by saying, Mr. Speaker, that I am so thrilled to be back in this House, and thank you so much to the people of Calgary, Midnapore for returning me to this chamber. Mr. Speaker, with, I will say, the highest number, I should say percentile of votes in Calgary, the highest percentile of votes in any major centre, and what I'm most proud of, Mr. Speaker, the greatest number of votes for any woman in Canada. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to be back in this House. And Mr. Speaker, I would also like to just take a moment to thank my team, which was so incredible throughout the election. I'd like to thank my campaign manager, Mr. Justin Gottfried, of course, the son of Richard Gottfried, the MLA for Calgary Fish Creek. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Katie Cook, who was my communications point person, my sister, Holly Schramm, who served as my official agent, keeping me in line and out of trouble with those books, most certainly. I'd also like to thank all of the incredible volunteers. I'd like to thank my family, my parents, Keith and Angie Schramm, who are still my constituents to this day. Of course, my very good friends who I grew up with in Calgary, Midnapore, who put out signs and who raised money for me, Joanna Morin, as well as Kaz Baines. And of course, I cannot go without thanking the loves of my life, my husband, James Kusie, and my beautiful son, Edward Kusie, who supported me in this journey back to the House of Commons. So thank you, I love you, and thank you so much again to the people of Calgary, Midnapore. Well, Mr. Speaker, here we are again in the House debating legislation on new benefits. And as the member across the aisle indicated, yes, we, in fact, on this side of House have been very collaborative and have certainly gone along with the government's requests for funds and for programs because we cared about Canadians, because we are compassionate individuals, and because we knew that was what Canadians needed at that time. Mr. Speaker, just a brief history of all of the times where we went along with the legislation because even though, despite concerns, we knew that was what Canadians needed at that time. So let's go back, Mr. Speaker, to March 13th, 2020, when C-12, an act to amend the Financial Administration Act, was presented. $1 billion in funding that was approving, Mr. Speaker. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? We didn't put up a fuss on this side. In fact, it received royal assent the very same day. Let's go forward a little bit further into time, Mr. Speaker. March 24th, 2020, an act respecting certain measures in response to COVID-19, C-13. Now, as the Shadow Minister for Families and Social Development at that time, Mr. Speaker, I will say that, in fact, it was a piece of legislation to fix the shortcomings which the government missed at the time that they created the original piece of legislation. But once again, we didn't put up a fuss on this side of the House because we recognized that was what Canadians needed at this time. And that bill also received approval from the House that day and royal assent the very next day. April 11th, 2020, Mr. Speaker, a second act respecting certain measures in response to COVID-19, C-14, that was Sue's, and we know there were certainly lots of faults with that at the beginning, as well as the CERB, received royal assent the very same day. Again, Mr. Speaker, I'm just pointing out the collaboration that this side of the House has always provided the government in getting Canadians the benefits that they need. So here we are again today, Mr. Speaker, being asked to approve C-2. But we're at a different time, Mr. Speaker. We are heading out of the pandemic. I recognize we have the Omicron variant and I hope not a fifth wave. But Canadians want to move forward into the future. And so I have a message for the government today, and that is, you don't get a blank check. You don't get a blank check. Mr. Speaker, it's time to move our economy from benefits to jobs. And I'm very proud to say that as the new Shadow Minister for Employment, future workforce development, and disability inclusion. Mr. Speaker, we currently have 1 million job openings, 1 million, with a 16.4% jump from August to September alone. That's incredible. Mr. Speaker, 1/5 of those are in the hospitality sector. Other major vacancies occur in these critical healthcare sectors, including nurses and psychiatric nurses. Mr. Speaker, we've heard in the House about the crisis in the trucking industry, how the average age of truckers is near retirement age, and how there are just not new workers coming forward to take these positions. In fact, Mr. Speaker, over 1/3 of employers have indicated that they have limited their job growth as a result of not being, growth in general as a result of not being able to find employees. So this affects every region, Mr. Speaker. So many sectors. I said this when I made my request for my emergency debate on Friday to have a discussion about the shortage of workers in the country. It affects l'épicerie au Québec, manufacturing sector in Ontario, and of course the tourism sector in my home province of Alberta. So for this reason, again, I say, Mr. Speaker, you don't get a blank check. All right. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move on to something that's very uncomfortable to talk about, and that is the fraud that we've seen with these programs, Mr. Speaker. In fact, FinTrack reported that there were organized criminals who knowingly and actively defrauded the government with both CERB and CEBA programs. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, that social media was used to recruit people, and in fact, stolen identifications were used in an effort to get these funds. There was the use of prepaid cards to prevent a paper trail, Mr. Speaker. So they were very smart about this. They knew what they were doing, unfortunately for the government. In addition, there were individuals who received these funds while not even living in Canada, and in fact, Mr. Speaker, living in jurisdictions of concern, countries that pose a higher money laundering or terrorist financial risk. Since the start of 2020, Mr. Speaker, until October 31st, 30,095 suspicious transaction reports were registered for COVID-related benefits. Over 30,000, Mr. Speaker. And sadly, Mr. Speaker, 30,000 of those also dealt with human trafficking and drugs, two issues on which this government has failed. But bad news, Mr. Speaker, prosecutions are unlikely. Why? In July 2020, the Canadian Revenue Agency advised the House of Commons Finance Committee that the program had been targeted by organized crime and that Canada doesn't prioritize the investigation and prosecution of financial criminals. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, in the past decade alone, Canada has secured less than 50 laundering convictions, less than 50 laundering convictions. This government is not taking organized crime seriously. So again, for that reason, I say, Mr. Speaker, say it with me, everyone, you don't get a blank check. All right, finally, Mr. Speaker, as I start to come to the end of my time, we need to get a grip on this in this country on inflation. Mr. Speaker, Canada is among the top 10 countries with the highest inflation rates in the G20. Canada has the second highest inflation rate in the G7, only to the United States, which I knew this government thought they would get along better with since they talk about the previous president all the time still. Rates are predicted to reach 4.9% this month, a 3-decade high, and expected to stay here well into 2022, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, some provinces are experiencing rates as high as 6.3%, including Prince Edward Island. And unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, it is low-income Canadians who spend 1/3 on shelter and 15% on food and higher energy prices. Mr. Speaker, we can't control the pandemic, but we can control spending. $74 billion on the CRB, $8 billion for this bill. If it passes, we should investigate the fraud, Mr. Speaker. We should evaluate this further, perhaps bring it to Finance Committee if they're willing to strike the Finance Committee up again. But my final message to them, everyone say it with me, you don't get a blank check. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I know the usage of you is through me. I understand I'm not writing a blank check, and I cannot respond. I cannot respond on behalf of the government either. Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de King.
The honourable member for King's Head.
Giving out any blank checks because the member certainly has been directing those questions through you. A couple things, because I watched both early in her speech in the House and was watching from the government lobby. I know the member is very passionate. The across the way, I don't think does a whole lot to advance her cause in a credible way. But what I want to say in a couple things on the blank check piece, we're in a minority parliament. We were in a minority before in the 43rd parliament. The government had no blank checks. We worked with parliamentarians of all stripes to be able to pass legislation here. We had to work with members of all sides. I presume that the member opposite actually voted against some of the measures to support, but let's talk about C-2, because that's why we're here today. Does the member support C-2 and the measures that are going to support Canadian businesses that are still impacted? Yes or no?
The honourable member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much to the member from Kings Heads for that question. I think it is very apparent that they wanted a blank check from the very beginning, and it was fortunately the member for Carleton who was able to recognize it at the time and make those amendments so that Canadians were not on the line for that, Mr. Speaker. As well, Mr. Speaker, I will say I outlined four incidents at the very beginning of the pandemic where we acted with collaboration, we acted with compassion, because we care about Canadians and we care about our citizens. And so, Mr. Speaker, we have compassion, but certainly we also have that oversight. And that's what I think really Canadians value and appreciate about us, is that we definitely will not provide blank checks, but we will always do what is necessary for Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Mont.
The honourable member for Montarville. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are currently looking at a bill on assistance measures for various sectors of the economy. And I think that is an excellent idea. However, as you know, in the pandemic, we saw what the limits of our health system are. And the government keeps repeating that we need to take care of our health system, but they're not taking concrete action. I would like the government to stop speaking about the health system while just using it as a sacred cow. I would prefer for the government to actually take action to help the health system. There was a time when the federal government funded the healthcare system to a level of 50%, but now that's plummeted to 23%. Now we're coming back to the theme that's been used by our conservative colleague, the blank check. It seems like the government is asking us for blank checks, but it's not doing what it committed to do in the past, which is to say, maintaining a 50% contribution for healthcare system costs. So what my question for my colleague is that I would like to ask her what she thinks of the Prime Minister's claim, which is that when provinces ask for more contributions, higher contributions from the federal government for healthcare, which is entirely necessary during a pandemic, because we saw the limits of our healthcare system. Well, what does my colleague make of the Prime Minister's claim when he says that this is a request for a blank check from the provinces?
Merci beaucoup, mon collègue, pour la question.
I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. And I think we can see here that the Bloc Québécois, like the Liberals, want to go back to the past. We, the Conservatives, are living in the present. We can see that with the questions that our Quebec Conservative Caucus made this week. This is a real issue for the Conservative Quebec Caucus. And what is really important to us is the matter of the labor shortage. We are turned to the future, whereas the Bloc Québécois is thinking about the past. I think that the Bloc Québécois should consider the future, just like our Conservative Quebec Caucus.